Hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to be called The Death of Heavy Metal. Now that might be a surprise to some of you. You know, you may think, has heavy metal really died? What do I mean by that? What do we mean by that? Well, I got into music because in the beginning I was a heavy metal fan, and this was a big, powerful music form. The bands that made it sold millions of records. They went to #1 in the charts. They did the biggest tours in the world. And they had a presence. Now, in this country, in the UK where I reside, I don't think we've had a group in the charts for the last few years, 3 or 4 years, let alone a heavy metal band. The status of heavy metal has gone from being one of the biggest forms in the world to sort of a niche form. There's people still listening to there's people still going to heavy metal festivals. There's labels, there's bands out there. But without a doubt, not only has the music become a lot less popular, but it seems to have become formularized as well. And we seem to be in a situation where it hasn't really changed that much for the last 20 years, maybe 30 years. So on this video, you're going to have to assume that this idea is correct, that heavy metal is either dead or dying, and I'm going to try and explain why I think that is. This is really inspired by a recent video Rick Beato did where he was like saying, where are all the metal bands? Where are all the metal bands? It's very difficult to name a big metal band where the people in it aren't at least 60 years old, and many of them approaching 70. Where are the new young metal bands? Now, I'm sure they're out there. When I taught in colleges, there seemed to be a never-ending supply of 16-year-old kids that were listening to metal and loved metal and wanted to play metal. But I became aware very quickly and tried to help them, but that there wasn't really any real scene out there for them to aim to where they would actually make any money or make a living. Yeah, there were bands out there. Yeah, they had these little deals. A lot of them were pop punk bands, and you went to see the gigs and there was 150 people turning up. And these are bands that the industry was sort of really going on about, really celebrating as being the new thing. But the record sales and the gig numbers didn't really attest to that. Of course, there's still metal bands around now that are doing good numbers on Spotify that can go out on tour, but as I said, I'm not too sure how old these people are. They seem to be late middle age at least. So I'm going to posit what I think has happened on this video. It's going to be a very simple video. I'm just going to tell you what I think. I'm going to tell a story, really. I'm going to tell a story of heavy metal. And to understand heavy metal, we have to understand heaviness. I think that's the key. There's a heaviness, an aesthetic of heaviness, which is embodied within heavy metal. It can be all sorts of different things. Distorted, overdriven guitars are definitely a big feature of heavy metal, but there's very many other styles that also have that sound as well. There tends to be quite doomy, depressing, dystopian lyrics. There seems to be a sort of a drawing towards the darker sides and darker themes of humanity. And I think that is the best place to start, is in that darkness. Heavy metal is attractive to predominantly young men, I think, because it represents an aspect of life which is dark and frightening and scary, and it occupies a similar place in music as horror does in filmmaking. That heaviness that darkness is embodied in growling, angry vocals, sometimes screaming vocals, big grooves, lots of drums, lots of thud. Not jazzy, not lots of cymbals, lots of thud. Lots of thud in the bass end, lots of bass. There's lots of bass. There's lots of distortion. Distortion is basically where you've taken a sound and you've pushed it so hard into the electronics that the wave, which was once round and soft, most instruments are soft, as you push them into the electronics, you push the sound into the amp or you push it into the wiring, it distorts. By that means, if you take the wave and if you come up, this wave bends in and it creates like a squarer shape. It's not as rounded. And that moves you from a sound which would be ooh to it's that the sound of things being pushed, and it's a hot sound. The darkness, the focusing on what troubles you rather than just singing nice songs and happy songs. In 1954, the biggest song, in popular music at that time was "How Much Is That Doggy in the Window?" And heavy metal acts as an antithesis to that type of thing. Pop music still eschews that sort of subject matter. It's always been there, light, positive, happy, celebratory. But metal, if it does that, it celebrates a sort of hedonistic debauchery that you are basically on a highway to hell if you go down the sort of heavy metal route of hedonism and pleasure. So I think the great innovation in the 20th century, there's two great innovations that basically create recorded music. One is jazz and the other is the blues. And in those two forms, we have the elements of heavy metal. Let's start with the blues. The blues as a songwriting form is revolutionary in that it doesn't follow a simple line of a happy song or a sad song. It seems to mix the two up. The folk music in America, which is the antecedent of the blues, is exactly the same folk music which is the antecedent of country music. Country music will often sing a very sad song in a major key, and that bittersweetness is something that is embodied in country music. In the blues, it's like almost round the other way. They are singing sometimes desperate songs, and the music's desperate. It's neither major or minor, and there's something celebratory in that desperateness. This is at once sacred and profane. The blues, if you go back to Charlie Patton and some of the early tunes by him, you will hear a hard-edged power chord, blocky, hard guitar style up against a growling voice. The very elements of heavy metal are in the blues as soon as we stuck a microphone in front of it and found out what it sounded like. So I would say that whatever the heavy metal is the natural extrapolation, as it were, of ideas that are in the blues. So in other words, if you take the blues and you try and go beyond the blues and push it forward, it will turn into heavy metal. But only if you are utilizing the instrumentation that comes from jazz. When jazz starts in the late 1910s, early 1920s, when it starts to be recorded, what we hear is basically what is called the front line lineup: clarinet, cornet, and trombone. The cornet playing the main melody, the clarinet whizzing above, and the trombone below. That's a certain arrangement of sound which is synonymous with New Orleans jazz. But jazz then changes, and by the time we get to the 30s, we now have the rhythm section, and we have this much slower 4/4 beat rather than the fast 2/4 beat. Fast 2/4 beats and slower 4/4 beats are going to be the bedrock of heavy metal. But what we see by the 1930s is we see the emergence of the rhythm section, double bass, drums, piano, and guitar. Now, to get the guitar in the mix, now, why have a guitar? Well, this goes back to early jazz where they would have a banjo. And the banjo was usually utilized because it was louder than an acoustic guitar. It was scratchy, and someone could strum the chords whilst walking down the road, keeping everybody, creating a chordal bass to the music, which punched through. The guitars often was in the rhythm sections to punch through. By the time we got to the big bands of the 1930s, an acoustic guitar could no longer punch through, and so there was a move towards electric guitars. And we see a whole host of guitarists emerging in the 1930s, but the most important one, in terms of this discussion, is Charlie Christian. Charlie Christian is the first serious electric guitar player. The way he plays is both bebop, jazz lines, but also very block chords. And we see in Charlie Christian the fundamental aspect that we're going to see in rock and roll guitar. The blues bands sort of merge with the jazz groups. You get a thing called rhythm and blues. There's a rhythm section playing blues, rhythm and blues. And the rhythm and blues bands become harder and more riffier. They employ saxophone, but the saxophone isn't the sort of delicate sound of Lester Young now. This is a very hard honking sound. And it drives people wild. By the time we get to the rhythm and blues in the 1950s, that's that very hard saxophone sound that we know in rock around the clock. But the guitars also coming in. Chuck Berry comes in, Ike Turner comes in, and we get this hard guitar sound which is pulling from certain blues artists like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf that have moved their sound over to an electric sound. And this is to line up with the rhythm section. The rhythm section emerges out of this. And the guitar becomes the instrument. It takes over from the saxophone. The 20th century could be divided in the age of the cornet or the trumpet, then the age of the saxophone, then the age of the guitar, and then eventually the age of the synthesizer and the sampler. The guitar becomes the instrument in 1950s. Kids all over the world are listening to Scotty Moore and Elvis Presley's band. They're trying to get those licks. And with the advent in the UK of the Marshall amplifier, which is really created by kids. Jim Marshall, who created the Marshall amplifier, was actually a drummer, and he had a drum shop, and he sold equipment in that shop. And so kids would come in and say, have you got a Vox AC30 amp? And he'd go, no. So he had the idea of building one, a Marshall version of that. And then Pete Townsend and kids like that, who were very young at the time, but were going into the shop, they were saying, is there any chance you could put 4 speakers in there, 4 12-inch speakers? You know the gain, when you turn it up, can you get it so it turns up more than the amp can take, so it distorts? The UK suddenly have the Marshall amp. A lot of the American rock bands in the mid-60s, they sound like souped-up bossa nova bands. If you think of Love or The Doors, there isn't that, stinging, scratchy guitar. But here in the UK, we have it. We see the Kinks in 1964 come out with that riff. Then we have, I Can't Get No Satisfaction in 65 by the Rolling Stones. And this heavy guitar sound starts to emerge. Eric Clapton walks into the studio to do the Beano album, with John Mayall. And he demands his guitar be turned up full blast and distort because he wants to get long singing lines out of the guitar. That rhythm and blues approach he then takes into Cream, and Cream start to do this sort of guitar, bass and drum sound. Hendrix then does it, and then we get the Jeff Beck group, we get Led Zeppelin, and we are moving towards a point in 1970 when Black Sabbath bring into this heavy blues rock, heavy distorted guitar sound, the missing element. And this is a darkness. Remember when I said that heavy metal is almost like the horror film of music? That is the great innovation of Sabbath, is to bring in these dystopian lyrics, satanic lyrics. And on the first album, we see them going through a whole host of different subjects which are dark, drug addiction, Satanism, weird dystopian science fiction ideas, and by the time we get to Paranoid, these ideas are completely in place. Black Sabbath, to put it simply, is Cream with satanic lyrics or demonic lyrics or evil lyrics. Going back to Howlin' Wolf, the guy that sung a song called Evil. Sabbath nail it there. Then throughout the 70s, we see a refinement of that. Deep Purple come out with In Rock, and they start to play quite accelerated 2/4 rhythms again. This goes right back to rhythm and blues. The point is that we can see that in the 1960s, these blues rock bands, when they tried to advance the blues, it turned into heavy metal. Heavy metal is running exactly alongside other forms of music which is under the umbrella progressive music. Especially progressive rock and jazz rock are informing the music. Guitar solos get faster and faster. The drums go to double bass drums. The heaviness that we heard with Black Sabbath is then refined by bands like the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and Billy Commons. The incendiary double bass drum approach starts to influence drummers at that time. And then you have progressive rock bands who start to, break away from the normal pop song structure, which Black Sabbath had done as well. And so these elements all swirl into the mix. And then it all comes crashing down in the 1970s because the music's become so removed from the normal kid who just wants to, plug in and embody their aggression, that heavy metal sort of splits. It splits into the sort of heavy metal that, Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, Judas Priest are playing, and punk rock. Punk rock is interesting in that, in a way, it's heavier than heavy metal at that time. It's faster, the guitars are more raucous, but it does not have the virtuosity that we would associate with a band like Deep Purple or Uriah Heep. And so punk emerges. And the other thing punk does is simplifies the song structures, and it moves away from the blues. People talk about punk being a return to sort of the visceralness of rock and roll. But groups like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols or whatever, the Clash or whatever it is, they take something away from the music at that point. To think that the Ramones are simply an embodiment of Chuck Berry is to see that now something's gone. And what it is that it's that aspect of the blues. It's there to some extent. Here in the UK, I think there's a very important band, and a band that really influenced me, was my first favourite band, and I loved them, which is Motorhead. And Lemmy was a brilliant proponent of rock and roll. Motorhead managed to retain the aspect of the blues of rock and roll, and at the same time play in a punky, accelerated way. Motorhead also did not go down the route of the image of punk. They stayed in a sort of new idea that is forming around heavy metal, which rather than looking like a bunch of hippies, you're clad in leather and studs, and there's a nod to sort of Nazi uniforms and war and things like this. And Motorhead, I feel, are so important in embodying so much that goes on to become what we know as the new wave of British heavy metal. I think Judas Priest play an important part, and then we have the rise of the sort of virtuoso guitar hero with Eddie Van Halen. We then get, Michael Schenker, Uli John Roth. Then we start to see the Randy Rhodeses coming in, and there's a whole traverse where it's as though heavy metal is revitalized by punk. And bands like Motorhead that are in the middle of it, and a few others like Judas Priest, you see they're influenced by punk. Their look changes, the sound changes, it becomes harder. It's almost like punk shamed heavy metal and went, you think you're heavy. And here in the UK again, we get the new wave of British heavy metal. Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, Angel Witch, Diamond Head, and then you get bands like Raven, Venom, Samson. There's a whole host of these bands at that time who are playing a sort of sped up version. It's raucous, it's raw, it's got a sort of do-it-yourself aspect. There's these small labels, signing up bands that have been recording in local recording studios, banging these records out. They're getting played in a very few places. Tommy Vance radio show. There was the new wave of British heavy metal guy. What was his name? Neil something? Who was DJing around the UK at that time. Sound started to cover this, and then Kerrang came out of that. And Kerrang was so important in showcasing to certain kids like me all these bands. I would buy Kerrang and write down every single band I saw in that, and then I would try and check them out, whether it's Crocus or Budgie or whether it was Marillion, whatever they were covering, I was exploring. So by the 1980s, we have this new wave of British heavy metal. It starts to influence the American bands, and in the Bay Area, we start to get the thrash metal bands, which are the natural American reaction to the new wave of British heavy metal. And of course, we get Anthrax and Slayer and Metallica and then Megadeth. And that is a certain line that's happening in the 1980s. On the other side, that sort of Led Zeppelin-y, Deep Purple-y type of rock music has combined with the more cartoony, childish elements of a band like Kiss, and has turned into what we could call the sort of hair metal bands that we saw in the 1980s, like Poison and Winger and eventually Guns N' Roses, who are looking back a little bit to the sort of older bands. And those two styles of music are completely separated. We've got these two styles. Now, what's going to happen there? Well, towards the end of the 1980s, other styles of music have kicked in, like rap, dance music, and heavy metal's looking at these in a quite a perturbed way. Do we rap? I mean, the music's heavy. This aspect of heaviness, right? This is very important. When I was a kid, that's what we were looking for all the time. We were always looking for the next record that was going to be heavier, where the guitar sounds were going to be more crunchy and more distorted, where there was going to be more screaming, where the drum beats were either so slow and lumbering or so ridiculously fast. These are all the aspects we were looking for on every single record, And I can remember, having cassette tapes of Venom simply because in 1981 or whenever it was, they seemed like the heaviest, fastest, most satanic band on the planet. There was a push, Napalm Death come in at that point then, and they start to bring in all this screaming and shouting and blast beats. You've got Charlie Benante in Anthrax, he's bringing in these blast beats, and you've got people screaming and shouting. But all of these things, all the way through, are pulling from jazz and blues. Some of the stuff that the thrash metal bands are doing is almost like free jazz. The rap that we see coming through is actually coming out of a tradition that goes back to the Last Poets in the 1960s. It's like a sort of jazz poetry type of thing. And the jazz fusion brings in sort of virtuosity through people like John McLaughlin to Al Di Meola, then on to Yngwie Malmsteen, and then on to bands like Racer X. And then those guitarists getting their big gigs, Marty Friedman coming up through a sort of almost like a jazz rock metal band, which is Cacophony, and then getting the gig with Megadeth. And every single band seems to have this incredible wizard of a guitar player, whilst people like Joe Satriani and Steve Vai, bizarrely by the mid 80s, are selling millions of records with these sort of these virtuoso guitar shred-a-thons that are going on. And all that becomes very important. By the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, if you think of a band like Extreme have all these aspects. They have the aspects of hair metal in there. There's an aspect of funk metal with a bit of rapping going on. There's old classic rock going on in there. The virtuoso guitar playing, neoclassical things, little bit of thrash metal. It's all in that band at that time. Bands like Living Colour have brought in aspects from jazz fusion, from funk to soul. Groups like Urban Dance Squad are looking at this sort of rap funk metal. Got the Red Hot Chili Peppers. by the end of the 80s, metal is fracturing even more, and you get sort of avant-garde groups like Mr. Bungle coming out, which are like a sort of teaming up of John Zorn avant-garde jazz, sort of eclectic, weird, kitsch music with extreme metal and screaming and all that type of stuff. I found this period very, very exciting. And through this, there is a return to that punk aesthetic that we discussed before. And out of that comes the grunge bands, well, at least Nirvana. You know, when we look at something like Soundgarden, we can hear there's a much closer tie to Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. And when we listen to, say, Pearl Jam, there's a much closer link to sort of Americana there, maybe even Lynyrd Skynyrd and groups like that. Alice in Chains has those beautiful, you know, upfront harmonies, you know, in the vocals and those incredible riffs. So grunge is an interesting thing because in returning to punk at that time, right, we again divorced the music away from the blues. But this is the point I want to make. Let's have a look at 1991 now. We're going back nearly 35 years. If you listen to Chris Cornell in Soundgarden or Kurt Cobain, and if you were to measure the amount of blues in that music, it's still soaked in the blues, right? There is a reason why Kurt Cobain, when they did the Unplugged, did that incredible version of that Lead Belly tune, and he pulls it off. He pulls it off. Later on, bands like the White Stripes are going to emerge, and they are still rooted in the darkness and heaviness that we've been describing all along. There's a heaviness there. There's a lumbering sort of darkness which is in the grunge bands. Even though they've moved through this, even though they've gone to that punk thing, it's different. I was not really a fan of punk that much, but I was a fan of the grunge bands because in the voice and the guitars and the drum beats, there was something that was darker and came from the blues. There was a groove. There was a groove, you know, all the way through. If you think of Matt Cameron's drumming in Soundgarden, and you think of something like, I don't know, Spoon Man. There's so much James Brown in there. There's so much funkiness there, and these guys, they're just soaking up John Bonham and Ian Pace, and these drummers are like, they're heavy New Orleans funk drummers. Metal for this whole time, however heavy it got, always had groove there. It always had the funk. It always had that slow, cool beat that was down deep. You know, and the blast beats were coming out of like almost like a jazz 2/4. It was like a, you know, baby please don't go, baby please don't go. That's going back. That's gospel. You know, we're going back to gospel. We're going back to early jazz, New Orleans. You know, the syncopated 2/4. That's there all the way through. Now, what's interesting is, of course, one constant through the whole history I've described is the band. Right, there's a reason why the band's so great. Imagine forming a trio with any other instruments. Maybe you had like a piccolo and a trombone and say, I don't know, an accordion. Think what that's going to sound like. Guitar, bass and drums. It's an orchestra. It can take your head off, and yet it's just three people. Three people that can come into a bar, bring in a drum kit, put the bass in, plug in, electric guitar, mic, and they can fill the room. And the techniques they're using are not pop techniques. It's because it's based upon the riff. And it's that riff thing where you've got the bass and the guitar in unison over a heavy groove. It's what Cream did. The space that's in a power trio when you go for the guitar solo and they start to scream on the guitar and there's no chords anymore and the bass is just unpinning it and the drumming is falling in, all that energy. This is an incredible thing. And for kids to get a few power chords down, maybe a rock pentatonic, get a rock group done, you know, a rock beat down and maybe a bass player being able to pedal like AC/DC on the bass. If you take three kids and put them into a room, you could show them that within a matter of minutes. And then when they do it, it's like magic. It's miraculous. It changes the room, and they're sat there going, You know, I can't believe I'm doing this. This is embodied probably best, or is probably there's an example of this that's brilliant in the film School of Rock. You know, when he does precisely that, he brings some kids in and he says, you play that pedal bass, you play this chunky guitar, spread your legs across, you do that rock beat, you know, and before they know it, it's suddenly, this magic comes together. Bands that were basically based upon that rhythm section. This is the Count Basie rhythm section. This is Charlie Patton's riffs and his voice. You know, this goes back to the source. Nirvana, Soundgarden, these new grunge bands go back to the source. Rage Against the Machine, they go back to the source. It's in all of these bands. Right up till, a band which is very interesting because it wasn't liked. So I remember towards the end of the 90s, there were two bands that emerged, and I loved one and I hated the other. There was Limp Bizkit, and Limp Bizkit seemed to drag any idea of dirt, blues, funk, you know, all that was removed, and it became like a crying session for sort of, you know, middle-class teenage boys to, you know, all say like, nah, man, I don't know. It was all that type of sound. Whereas Limp Bizkit had their feet in so many different camps, you know, rapping, but the rapping was funny, but it was also that sort of hedonist type, you know, we're going to party, but it's probably going to end up killing us all. Incredibly deep jazz, funk fusion influence grooves, an incredible bass player pulling from all that weird stuff that Les Claypool's doing in Primus, and then Wes Borland on guitar that was just had some of the heaviest, darkest, dirtiest riffs combined with this bizarre stage presence. Limp Bizkit, for me, were one of the last great rock bands. Now, I decided to check this, and I went and listened to the first three albums again before I did this video, and I was absolutely blown away. And I know why people didn't like it, because there's an anarchism that was in bands like Mr. Bungle and Faith No More, and it's in Limp Bizkit. But the fact was, the metal was going somewhere else, and people almost can't take the joke. It's not so much a joke. It's more of the fact that it's anarchy. It's strange. You know, there is a storyline. There's a sort of folklore behind it. So what killed it? Well, my proposition here, as you can probably guess as we get to this point in the video, is quite simple. That aspect of the blues was initially removed by punk. The punks came in and they were playing visceral rock music, expressing themselves, but they took the blues out of it. And I think there's a certain intellectualism that exists in the music press where they hear something that is devoid of the blues being played by, I hate to say it, but white people, they feel that that's more artistically valid. They have no problem with the Princes of this world or the Tina Turners of this world of exploring that. But they don't like it when a white rock band's doing it. If you then combine that with any level of virtuosity, the music press back at that time were distrustful of this. They would much rather champion Sonic Youth, you know, or The Cure or the Swans as being great art, because that's heavy metal, but it's not heavy metal because it's devoid of the blues. You see, Guns N' Roses is full of the blues. AC/DC is full of the blues. All these groups up to a point are full of the blues. Okay? It then is removed. It's also, the blues has been slowly removed from popular music. And we are now back at a sort of bastardized version of hip-hop production combined with how much is that doggy in the window, but highly sexualized because it's linked to videos that are then, you know, getting lots and lots of views because of the salacious material, thus gaining lots and lots of sort of royalty payments, you know, for 1 billion plays on YouTube or Spotify. That is where popular music has gone. But of course, the other thing I haven't mentioned is once you divorce the music of the blues, the machines can copy it. The machines can copy it. If you take John Bonham, and many people have done this on YouTube, if you were to put that into a computer and then quantize and put it all in time and then re-trigger all the drums, now no longer sounds like John Bonham. John Bonham sounds like that because there's these microscopic, microtonic, micro-rhythmic anomalies that exist, which are part of his personality. He imprints himself on. And it's not just his personality in a vacuum. It's a guy that's listened to Bernard Purdie, that's listened to Ringo Starr, that's listened to Gene Krupa, that's listened to Ginger Baker, and assimilated all those fingerprints. It's not about chops. There is an essence in music. And whilst you had bands, and whilst you had those power trios with these kids in the room, and whilst they were putting their heads into the recordings and learning the essence, none of these kids were learning to read music. It's not about what's on the page. It's about picking up the essence of Hendrix, picking up the essence of Ritchie Blackmore or Jeff Beck, picking up the essence of Tommy Aldrich or Ian Pace or Ken Kerslake, or Ainsley Dunbar. All these drummers, they're all different. Simon Kirke, they're all different. And if you put your head in there like that and you just assimilate it, you come out with your version of it. And rock music was built upon all this. These little anomalies were always there. When the grunge bands came out, production was at a certain point then that they started to be able to re-trigger bass drums and snare drums. So we start to hear the same bass over and over again. Production's become a bit samey, so there's a way of getting a guitar sound. And then the engineers know how to do it. It's still idiosyncratic enough to make those albums still sound very interesting. But as digital technologies come in, the producers take over. And no more so that in heavy metal. By the end of the 2000s, and we really have digital audio workstations doing their thing, you could see, and I saw this myself with my own eyes, a metal band would go into the studio to be produced. They're there because the producer is actually going to be able to create a sound which will get played on metal radio. We used to say this to our students: you're not going to get played on metal radio. Why? Because your bass drums have got to click. Your guitars have got to sound crunchy, that everything's got to be louder than everything else. We're giving the loudness wars, and you need someone who can deliver that. And so they would get their pennies, and you would send them off to some sort of producer. And I was friends with these guys. They would turn up, and then mics would be put onto the drums. Everything would be close mic'd. And actually the sound of the drums didn't matter, because all you would use the drums for was to trigger. Then you drop in your triggered sounds, and now you're triggering that heavy metal bass drum. It's the same bass drum sound that everybody uses. It's that same clicky metal sound. Guitars, you might be in a room playing for an amp, but now they're not miking up your amp as much as actually putting a DI box in between your guitar and the amp, and then sending the clean signal in that they can then send afterwards into their digital, doesn't exist in the real world virtual amplifier, and they can dial in the same sound as everybody else. Same with the bass. The vocals are going through a system where every dynamic has been squashed out because they have the compression up full, they have the gate up full, and every single note is sculpted into place. Every harmonic note is tuned into place. The techniques that had been used to develop for dance music then get applied to heavy metal. We have had now, I would say, at least 20 years, 25 years of this happening to heavy metal. And it all sounds the absolute same. The amount of bands I've taught where they've got a real drummer, and then the kid gets his head around production, and he starts programming drums using a decent sounding kit. Something like BFD was one that people use, Superior drummer people were using at the time. Don't know what they're using now. But these, to the layperson, are indistinguishable from real drums. Now, it's very easy to blame the computers of that sort of production methodology on why heavy metal's in the position it is now. But for me, what I've posited here, it's the moving away from the blues. Now, you could do an experiment if you like. Go and listen to a modern metal band and listen to the singing. And what you will hear is a voice that wouldn't be out of place on the Eurovision Song Contest or maybe in a musical theatre piece. Listen to those singers and then go back and compare them to Lane Staley, Eddie Vedder, Kurt Cobain or Chris Cornell or James Hetfield or any of those people. And you will hear when you go back to there is a growl and there is that essence that is actually, it's coming out of Howlin' Wolf. Now this, and Howlin' Wolf's coming out of Charlie Patton, and Charlie Patton's coming out of something we don't understand, a mystery that then just goes off into the ether. It's fascinating that heavy metal for me is the late 20th century embodiment of a mystery that exists in 20th century music. I haven't talked that much about the blues on this channel, and I haven't gone back to early blues, and I want to do that. But it's worth thinking this. When I used to teach music, one of the earliest lessons I did with the kids was we would go into a classroom, there'd be a whiteboard on the board, and I go, what's your favourite band? And they might say back then, so they go, Avenged Sevenfold. And I'll say, right, Google Avenged Sevenfold, see what their influences were. They would get a set of influences, Avenged Sevenfold. Who would they have been influenced by? Perhaps Metallica. And so we would then look up Metallica. What were their influences? Well, it's groups like Diamond Head, Black Sabbath, blah, 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 and we'd do that. Then we would look at who their influences, who's Black Sabbath's influences. Well, they were influenced by soul, they were influenced by bands like Cream, they were influenced by blues bands. Tony Iommi was really, really inspired by Django Reinhardt. So I'd write those people up, and then we try and see where Django Reinhardt's coming from. And Django Reinhardt's coming out of a guitarist called Eddie Lang and Lonnie Johnson. And Eddie Lang and Lonnie Johnson, we now back to the beginning. We can't go further than that because we now go into the realm where there's no recording. Lonnie Johnson was the first great blues player to play single lines. He was the first guitarist, in fact, to play single lines. Lonnie Johnson should have statues all over the world because he invented the guitar solo. He invented single line playing. Eddie Lang, of course, instantly joined in. Those two players were so important in the history of music. But we're back at jazz and blues, and we're back at the blues with Lonnie Johnson. And Lonnie Johnson, we can then go back from there into the hinterlands, and, you know, maybe we always end up with that bloke with the knife sat at that station down south somewhere. The W.C. Handy spots it in 1903, you know, sort of playing this sort of bastardized Hawaiian music on a guitar and scraping the knife up and down to get all those slides and all that type of stuff. That's what we're going back to. Then we pick up the next band, you know, and then we get a totally different band. And we do that thing, and every time we would just track the influences back and we would end up back with the blues. Heavy metal is the 20th century extension of the blues into the sort of technological realm of electricity. That's what it is. If you think of a tune that came out in '67, a groundbreaking tune by Captain Beefheart called Electricity, and you listen to the way he says, electricity, as he says that in his voice is the embodiment of heavy metal. And where's that voice coming from? It's coming from Howlin' Wolf. And where's Howlin' Wolf coming from? Howlin' Wolf is coming directly out of Charlie Patton. And where's Charlie Patton coming out? Well, the guy who taught him, a mysterious, a mythical person. Did they actually exist? A guy called Henry Sloan, perhaps, that taught Charlie Patton. And there's some people that believe Henry Sloan was that guy on that station that W.C. Handy spotted in 1903 that basically gave birth to blues as a worldwide phenomenon. Before recordings even existed. This is an incredible thing. That guy, there's a plaque up there now. There's a whole thing that if you go to that station, I wish I could tell you where it was because I never planned on talking about this when I started this video. But that's where I've ended up. I've naturally ended up there. I've ended up on that station platform with W.C. Handy, marveling at some guy, some old African-American guy sat with a guitar in his lap, busking and playing the guitar with a knife and sliding a knife up and down the steel strings of the guitar and getting that scrapiness. And that guitar would have been tuned to a chord, most likely a D minor chord. That sort of sound that people like Skip James explored on the guitar. That D minor sound, which was rather than the sort of usual G major tuning or the more folky dadgad, the D minor tuning is something I've been experimenting with myself. And as soon as you play it, and as soon as you strum it and start to hit some notes, you're into this darkness. You're into the minor. You're into the minor, and it's very easy to create these scattered major thirds against minor thirds, and really embody a heaviness. To embody heaviness. That's what heavy metal was. And I'm afraid it rose up like a wave at the beginning of the 20th century, and it formed absolutely everything. The blues is in country music, the blues is in rock and roll, the blues is in rhythm and blues, the blues is in gospel. The blues runs through absolutely everything. It's in soul music, it's in reggae, it's in rock music, it's in metal, it's in funk, it's in house music, it's in disco, right? The blues rises like a wave in the 20th century, and as it crashes into heavy metal, and then it scatters. And now with this sort of exiting of the epoch of rock and roll, that postmodernist period, as we leave that behind, we sort of have to leave heavy metal behind. It no longer operates as it did culturally. It doesn't have a relevance anymore. Every aspect of heavy metal that scared the parents at that time is now the domain of children. Jack Black's School of Rock was, I think, the example of that. You know, it's we see it as being childish rather than see it as being life-affirming. The very thing that heavy metal does is no longer relevant. And so it becomes what Steel Panther, you know, sort of postmodernist nod to what Motley Crue were like, you know, or a million thrashy, screamy bands that have a nice chorus in, you know, where everything has actually been created on a machine, or the sort of robotic kids on Instagram playing these incredibly fast blast beats perfectly, but with an ounce of angst or anger in them. Heavy metal is about heaviness. Heaviness was an aesthetic which was unique to the 20th century. Yes, I can hear it in Mussorgsky's Night in a Bear Mountain or Pixar's Exhibition. You know, I may even hear it in some of Beethoven's dun 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 dun. You know, maybe it's there. It is there. Maybe heaviness was always sort of there. Where's heaviness now, and where does it reside? That's the question. If the metal bands were to go back to what I'm describing, this dirty bluesy, would it just be a pastiche? Would it just be Steel Panther? I don't know. But that is my thoughts on the emergence and eventual, not death, but perhaps comatose state in which heavy metal finds itself. So the question is, you know, when do we switch the life support system off? I'm not the man to say that, you know. My lot is to have ended up at 57, having a YouTube channel where I celebrate and explore these ideas for other late middle-aged men to ponder on what once was. But it was glorious, wasn't it? Thanks for watching. See you on the next video. If you like this, like, subscribe. If you want to see more videos like this, please let me know. And I just want to say, you know, I've filmed this in 4K, which I'm moving to 4K at the moment. So I hope that went down well. So this is a bit of an experiment, which is why there's no graphics in there yet. I'm playing around with it, you know, so. I didn't want to mention it at all, but you know what I'm like, I can't help but blab out what's going on. So if you appreciate this sort of look and you felt that, you know, was an improvement, you know, stick it in the comments. Thank you all. Serious video, no jokes, no telephones going off, no impressions, but they will be back soon. See you all, bye.